Hello, this is Robin Hill, architectural photographer. You're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. In the Modernist Kitchen today, we've got a full-course meal, starting with architect and author Scott Specht, architecture photographer Ste Murray, and wrapping up for dessert, the always delightful hosts of the podcast Bad Architecture, Sara Tietje-Mietz and Erin Kennealy. And now the usually delightful host of this podcast, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Speaking of food, let's talk about modernist cuisine. One would think from the name that any architecture fan would love it, but that's not exactly true. It's really hit and miss, but the adventure is in the journey, right? Modernist cuisine is an existential, deconstructed exploration of the edible, where science meets the kitchen in a way that would make Julia Child resign as chef and open up her own Arby's. You take a perfectly good dish, you break it down into its most basic components, and then you rebuild it into something kind of unrecognizable. Okay. Imagine a deconstructed shepherd's pie, where the mashed potatoes are a cloud of dehydrated potato foam. The lamb is a single perfectly cooked ball the size of a chickpea, and the gravy is a dot so powerful it has a warning label. Forget plates. Instead, think of tiny spoons, pebbles, and strategically placed tweezers. Your food will arrive looking like a mad scientist chemistry experiment.
You know, I'm not getting hungry listening to this.
Modernist portions are about the size of a pebble or two, maybe, if you're lucky. But hey, at least you can brag about having a 10-course meal, one pebble at a time. And forget about vegetables. You're more likely to get liquids made into tiny balls, sometimes frozen, that burst in your mouth with a surprising and usually pleasing pop. So, is this dehydrated air? Is a guaranteed conversation starter with your server. Half the dishes I tried, I would never try again, but that means the other half were pretty good.
Okay.
And don't worry about overeating, because afterwards, you may want to hit Arby's. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of modern Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Architect Scott Specht studied at the University of Florida and at Yale. After that, he worked with Daniel Libeskind, Deborah Burke, and at the firm Cohn Peterson Fox, where he was the designer on a number of tall building projects around the world. Scott is now the founding partner of Specht Novak and was named as a top 100 architect by New York Magazine. He has been a featured speaker at TEDx and was a co-author of the book Coffee Lids. And when he was about 14, he shot a sci-fi movie with both live action and animation called Dissolve. It's about the return to Earth of planetary explorer 421. On the voyage home, the spacecraft becomes contaminated, overruns the critical swing state of Ohio, and according to the Bradenton, Florida Herald, threatens to engulf the Earth until an unexpected UFO arrives to save the day.
Hey, Scott, before we start talking about architecture, how does this movie end, assuming we're not going to see this in our local theater?
Yeah, in the end, I it's been so long since I've seen it. It's on Super 8 film. I never got it transferred to digital. So, who knows how it ends. But I think it was, some UFO came from outer space and shot a laser at it and cleared it all up. So
that's good.
I believe that was the end of it. It wasn't much of a plot, honestly.
And I think it's fair to say that Star Trek, the first feature film in 1979, ripped off your plot because they're pretty similar.
Yes, I need to get that lawsuit underway. It hasn't happened yet. So.
And our next question, Scott, is what would happen if you ingested caffeine? Because there's a warning label on some of your material.
No, I get it. Yeah, no, I went to decaf several years ago. I need to update that, though, because I started drinking real coffee in the morning again. It was affecting sleep. But now I found I can have 1 or 2 cups in the morning. So it makes a big difference.
Yeah, it does.
Well, awesome. You and your business partner, I guess your former business partner now, who have offices in New York and Texas, you are co-owners of the world's largest collection of disposable plastic coffee lids.
Correct.
More than 550 of them.
That's right.
I never thought of lids as an art form, but you have definitely discovered this. What is this universe that we don't know about, Scott?
It's pretty amazing. It actually started when Louise Hartman, who's my ex-partner, we started our business in New York many, many years ago. But we just started noticing, we were in grad school together, and both of us at the same time, I think, were fascinated with everyday objects and the design of everyday objects, overlooked objects, you might say, and started collecting coffee lids on our own. Because if you went to different coffee shops, every coffee shop had a different lid design that tried to solve the problem of if you're in your car driving around and you have your cup and a cup holder, what prevents that coffee from sloshing out during your drive? So they all had some sort of peel back lid that you could clip on or a special device that you'd slide over to close it. And
I've spilled a lot of coffee working those lids.
Still do.
Yeah.
It's like, the thing that kind of everyone settled on are those green plastic plungers that kind of stick in the coffee when you're driving and you pull them out. But there used to be hundreds and hundreds, like I said, of these things, and it became kind of a patent fascination for certain people. I'm going to invent the perfect coffee lid. Oh. And so there were just so many of these things. As we collected them, Louise and I got together and were like, hey, have you seen these? Have you seen these? And so we started collecting together, and you just amassed a major collection over time. Now you can only find 2 or 3 different variations.
How many are in your collection?
Yeah, over 500. So I think you're right, about 550 now.
Have you ever had an exhibition, Scott?
We do. We have. We've had a number of exhibitions. Well, the one that's lasted the longest is at the Smithsonian Museum of American History in Washington. They had a whole exhibit on fast food, and it was right at the entrance. And I believe that exhibit that went up 10 years ago, I think it's still there.
Wow.
They haven't had a high budget to change out exhibits, so I think they've just kept it in place.
Well, if you're going to have an exhibit somewhere, the Smithsonian's the place to do it.
It is. It was quite an honor.
We came across you with regard to a really beautifully designed house called the Preston Hollow House in Texas. Tell us about that.
That was our biggest house to date at the time we did it. And, it was a great client. The client, strangely, was a mass home builder. They built suburban houses. When we first got the client on, we were a little worried that, are they going to want to use their contracting, their people on board to build this, and what kind of quality we're going to get out of that? And they said, nope, we want to do something that is amazing and a showpiece. And, we're going to let you be in charge of how it's built and who builds it and everything else. So we're very grateful to that. The idea behind that house was really, Dallas is a somewhat unusual urban setting in that there are urban houses that are on independent lots, but they're very, very close to downtown. And a lot of these are very small, but worth quite a bit of money. So this client found one that was a little on the larger side and wanted to use every square inch of the property they had, but do it in interesting and creative ways. And they're really inwardly focused properties because you have neighbors right next to you, even though they're fairly expensive lots. So we really built this house around a series of courtyards that looked internally or towards a backyard view that's well screened. And we used custom cast concrete, pulling a little bit of inspiration from brutalist architecture into it, but lightening it up with a floating, sort of a hovering roof with clear story windows below it. It's sort of the perfect project for an architect. You have a client who really appreciates what you do, come in, give you a really decent budget, and let you run with it from there. We really loved working on that.
I mean, this is a house whose design is so timeless and classic without being repetitive or ripping off anybody. It's really quite an achievement. I mean, you look at it and you go, well, this house could be in Los Angeles, it could be in New Canaan, it could be anywhere, and still just sort of fit beautifully into that whole mid-century vibe, which is now, 100 years later almost, the 21st century vibe.
Right, exactly. It also was drawing inspiration from Dallas, which is a very strange city, is that there is a history of modern houses there done by very well-known architects. And so you have the Wachowski house by, Richard Meyer, and you've got a Philip Johnson house, and you've got this whole slew of really beautiful houses. There's an Edward Durrell Stone house there that's really was an inspiration of sorts with screen walls, and it was sort of inward looking as well. So it plays on that too, of really trying to do beautiful pieces of architectural art distributed throughout these areas of the city. There's one going up across the street from the one we just did by Tom Pfeiffer right now that's, from what I've seen of the drawings, is amazing. It's mostly underground. It's an art gallery, more or less, but the owners will live there as well. So yeah, Dallas has some interesting traditions.
You can see this house and many others by Scott at spechtnovak.com. That's SPECHTNOVAK.com. Tell me, Scott, about the house you did in New Canaan, Connecticut, the epicenter of mid-century modern.
Yes, another one where there's a lot of pressure on you to live up to the neighborhood, let's say. Yeah. So that was one of our very first large houses that we got. Another client that came to us and gave us free reign. It started, interestingly, as a 1970s/80s house, really poorly built, poorly done. And the client came to us wanting a renovation of some small areas. We were still a pretty small firm at the time. So they wanted a new kitchen and a few other things. And that's one of the houses where the more we showed them, the more they wanted out of the house. So it went from being a remodel down to all that was left was a small part of the foundation, and the house is new from the ground up.
Essentially new, right?
Yep. Yeah. And that happens a lot. People have an emotional attachment. When they buy a place, they've spent so much money on a house. They really have an aversion to tearing it down and starting over from scratch. But it's often the most cost-effective way to deal with it. By the time you get down to tearing off roofing where everything inside can get wet and you have to take the sheetrock off, all of that, it would have been better just to take it all down. You end up with a few sticks that you end up, recladding if you don't do that. So we try to talk clients into, when it gets to that point of tearing down a structure and starting from scratch, we try to preserve where we can, though. So if it makes sense to preserve, we do. And if it doesn't, we will tell the client.
Now, these are fairly large houses and quite expensive. On the other end of the spectrum, you've invented the Zero House. What is that one about?
Yeah, our office practices I guess now it's somewhat unusual way. It didn't used to be. Like when I came of architectural age, let's say, I went to grad school in the 90s. It was sort of a recession era, and most people did experimental projects along with their built work because there wasn't much built work going on at the time. So you see like Rem Koolhaas was much earlier doing Delirious New York, but it was a similar idea of, you have pictures of your built projects, you have pictures of your experiments. So we've kept that up over time. The Zero House started as an experimental project of completely freestanding, self-sufficient thing you just drop in place and it runs itself. And so it has helical anchors that only anchor the house to the ground at 4 points. It's got a giant solar wing at the top that collects rainwater. Got a lot of press for that. And a number of people called us wanting to build it. But when it came down to numbers, as it always does, it was a very expensive proposition. So none actually made it past the talking stage. We're actually excited about this newer experimental project that's being built right now called the New American House. That one I'm building for myself in Austin, Texas.
Isn't that always the case? If you're going to be a pioneer, you got to do it for yourself, right?
Too often it happens, or for your parents.
Yes, that's right.
Parents are always good if they have the resources. So.
Now, from your point of view, what are some of the predictions on the state of housing in the U.S.? What are the trends you're going to see happening between now and, say, 2030?
Yeah, we did a TED Talk on this, and we did a good bit of research beforehand. And the trend seems to be going toward smaller houses in general. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but a lot of these suburbs, the children, there were families in them, and they've aged out and are gone now. So you have a lot of older people living in very large houses that they don't need the space, quite honestly. And so a lot of our work that comes in are people downsizing. They want something that is small, but not losing the comfort that they're used to by moving into a smaller space. And I think that trend is going to pick up. And I also think that people realize they don't need these gigantic, inflated houses that they've been living in for years in many ways. A lot of it was like, 16-foot ceilings in foyers to give an impressive feeling for your guests when they come. We're finding less and less of that. It's really about making the most of the space you do have and really being efficient about it and doing beautiful things. We're also doing some very large houses, but the intent behind those is as much of a business proposition in some ways as anything else. There are people who run businesses and use their house for entertaining largely. So a lot of times that takes place as well.
Did your client in Texas, your developer client, sort of steal any ideas from that and start incorporating them in his own developer houses? I mean, I would hope so. That would be a great compliment to you.
Yeah, we in fact, we talked to him about doing developments of some of these experimental houses. And I think the business model there is something that's fairly rigid. It's kind of locked into a certain type of house that's sold traditionally over time, and they do a lot of market research and things like that. So he wasn't quite ready to do that. So no, it didn't have any effect. They were completely separate.
Because you're seeing such innovation now, particularly in Texas. Texas is doing that first 3D printed community of houses designed by Bjarke Ingels.
Yeah, there is a lot going on. Even before that, there are several developments in Austin that have tried not to do this sort of traditional peaked roof Tuscan style suburb. They've done based their houses on more mid-century modern appearance. There are whole communities here of small houses, of micro houses. The 3D printed house, there was one done by Lake Flato that became a model, and now there are beginning to be more of those. So it is fertile ground for some experimentation. Unfortunately, in the Austin area and some of the other areas nearby, the land prices have gone up so much that, we've done some looking for properties we could build some of these ideas on, and it's gotten a bit out of hand. Maybe that's returning to a normal mean lately, but it's still pretty rough.
Now, unless you're an airplane geek like I am, you're not going to know, because it's never been in the news, that there's a brand new international airport in Tulum, Mexico. Oh. And you have designed, is it called Casa Zixim? Is that how you say it?
Shishim.
Shishim. Yes. I got that completely
Those
wrong.
X's come out like SH's.
Okay. Yeah. Shishim. It's an off-the-grid bioresort.
Yeah, it means zero in a Mayan dialect, I think. That's where the name came from.
So how did this project come about? Is it online and operating?
It is. It's been there for quite a few years. It was an odd story. When I was younger, you mentioned making this film when I was younger. And when I first got out of architecture school, undergraduate architecture school, I actually didn't want to do architecture at that point. I wanted to be a filmmaker. And so I put together this brochure kind of my production design work called Boomtown, and it had a little story that went behind it, but built a lot of sets and models and things and photographed it, sent them all over. And I sent them to big names. David Lynch was one of my favorites at the time. And, his secretary called me a few times and said, he really enjoyed it, but we don't have any places for you right now. I ended up getting a job in New York at a special effects house that did motion graphics for television, TV, like intros for news programs and things.
Eyewitness News. Dun, 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 dun.
Exactly right. Yep. And at the time, it was not done by computer. All those graphics were done by hand-drawn cells that were then animated on a big Oxberry animation stand. But anyway, the point I'm getting to is at this company, I met another filmmaker who we became good friends, and he recommended us with knowing very little about our work, but recommended us to do his parents' house, which we did. And then we just kept in touch. And they eventually bought this piece of land in Tulum and said, hey, we want you to do our resort property here. And that's how that came about.
Yeah, Tulum is not too far from Cancun.
Right, south.
Yeah.
South. It's a couple hours drive south of Cancun. Yeah. And they're building a railroad, theoretically, at least.
They're building a railroad,
Express, I think it's called.
This brand new international airport. It has the record for going like from 0 to 60 and fast. They had 4 or 5 airlines, operated it immediately. Because there's so many resorts in the Tulum area along the coast.
Right.
That it's going to pull traffic away from the Cozumel, Cancun area, kind of overloaded.
Yeah, I think it's already done that pretty substantially. I think Tulum has become a big thing recently. It was interesting building in Tulum, the sort of idea that certain areas of Tulum, you cannot build a permanent structure. It has to be movable, but the concept of what is movable is sort of vague and up to the local authorities in charge at the time. So
now, why is this because it's sacred land, or why is that restriction?
It's considered, Tulum Beach, the properties along there are considered environmentally sensitive. They're part of what's more or less like a national park along there. So you can build properties there, but they have to be removable if the state decides them not to be there anymore. So it's gone back and forth. A lot of people have run into problems of building things that are too permanent. Luckily, this property was a little bit further south of those areas. So we were able to do something that was permanent and stable. So it's an all concrete structure. Interestingly designed so that, with woods that are water resistant and everything, so it can get a lot of storm surge and rainwater blowing through and nothing really gets damaged too badly.
The website is spechtnovak.com, SPECHTNOVAK. Scott, thanks for joining us, and I hope you'll do a sequel to your first film.
Yeah, maybe that will be coming at some point in the future.
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Photographer, actor, and architect Ste Murray has been interested in architecture since he was just a boy, filling up his notebooks with drawings of cities and skyscrapers. His parents instilled a love of photography and acting, which is kind of a rare combination with architecture. Even so, throughout his professional life, Ste has continued to pursue all three passions. These days, he specializes in architectural and performance photography. One of his recent series explores the Clifton Cathedral in Bristol, England, on its 50th anniversary. It's part of a larger project that has thus far documented 4 modernist marvels at their half-century mark. Welcome to the show, Ste.
Thanks for having me, guys. Thanks very much.
So, Ste, for hundreds, maybe couple thousand, 2,000 years, the cathedrals have been kind of all the same. Kind of Gothic, little Roman, very classic. And then modernism came along. When did the first modernist cathedrals get built in the UK?
Good question. I guess it's something I'm trying to explore through photography. But these things started to emerge, I guess, in the 20th century. And not just in the UK. I mean, worldwide, people were looking for new ways to stake their claim on land and to attract people. And sometimes new forces were in play, governments and things like that were overthrown, or regimes were overthrown in other countries. And so people were looking for a new way to express themselves. So I wouldn't just say it's just in the UK that we see a lot of modernist and brutalist structures, but also sometimes it pops up in surprising places, such as Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe.
What was the first one that you discovered?
No, I wouldn't call myself an expert on modernist church design.
Right.
But there's definitely a few that come to mind. I made a trip to Columbus, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Columbus, Indiana?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Right.
The Mecca, and if we're using religious terms here, then that's certainly some sort of a Mecca or a pilgrimage that I think people have to do, especially if a lot of your listeners are based in the US. I mean, if you're swinging by Chicago, why not head on down to Columbus, Indiana anyway, which is what I did a few years ago. I loved it there. There's a lot of good examples of church architecture there. There's one by Saarinen.
Yes.
Which is just fantastic. So,
what was the first one you discovered in the UK?
The one I photographed last year was in Bristol. And the way I kind of came to find it was through this series, as Tom said there, that I'm starting to photograph buildings as they turn 50 years old, which is almost like this kind of accidental series. I guess some things don't become a series until you keep doing them. I'm sure even every podcast had a first episode that they might not have thought about if there'd be a second or a third or a fourth and so on. So this is kind of an accidental series that started in 2018 photographing the Space House in London, which isn't a church. That would have been finished 50 years previously, so 1968.
Was it
and it's
space themed or something?
I think it was circular, and I think it was for the Civil Aviation Authority.
Oh.
And it's since had lots of different users and owners, so there's probably different names floating around online, but I thought the Space House was the most interesting name, right? This is a kind of a circular brutalist building by Richard Seifert.
Okay.
That was the first one I looked into doing. And I guess these started as a series, like a lot of photographers do. You know, you're very happy doing your commercial work and you've got a great list of clients and you're challenged within that kind of sphere. But there's always something you kind of just want to explore, or an itch that you want to scratch. Or for me, it was trying to move into photographing larger scale of buildings. So for the first 8 years of my career, I was photographing a lot of houses and a lot of domestic projects, which I love and enjoy. But I wanted to start to photograph the kind of larger scale projects that had a lot more factors going on. So urban factors or environmental factors around them. So I'm talking a lot about the context there. And London is only like 45 minutes away from Dublin by air, not by foot, obviously.
Not by car.
No, unless you drove really fast. So I take the trip over every few months anyway to kind of try keep up with some clients there on the commercial side of things, also to see shows and things like that. It's a great place. So I took the camera over and I photographed the Space House in 2018, not really overthinking the brief too much. I guess the idea was that there was no brief and that you're kind of free to almost do this tribute to a building, but also maybe be kind of critical about it, especially at the 50-year point. The buildings, when they turn 50, are at this really interesting place. Some of them have been renovated. Some of them are in need of renovation. And then in 2019, I did a similar kind of approach with the John Hancock in Chicago. And then there was a little interruption in 2020. I don't know if you guys know, but there was this worldwide interruption.
Yeah.
You might have heard about it. Yeah.
Some people got a cold.
Yeah. So things kind of took a bit of a, as I said, this series didn't really develop until you start to make it a series. And then in 2022, I kind of revisited that by going back to London and photographing the Brunswick Centre, which is this kind of almost football stadium style apartment / commercial complex in London. And then, last year then was the cathedral in Bristol. So there's been 4 of these kind of 50-year anniversary photo shoots where I go and I spend a day with a building.
Okay, so it's only one has been a cathedral, but they're all at the 50-year mark, which just from a physical standpoint, as well as a stylistic standpoint, that's some distance. You must have discovered some things about these buildings that has changed over time.
Yeah, the 50-year thing is interesting, and people seem to really latch onto that. I think it's a really nice narrative, firstly. It gives them all a kind of a common thread, because it means then I can photograph commercial building or, an office building like the Space House, or a skyscraper like the John Hancock, or a apartment complex like the Brunswick, or then a cathedral like in Bristol. And I guess it gives them a kind of common thread. But the kind of one flaw, which I kind of love about the 50-year thing, is that if I only keep doing one a year, eventually the one that I started with is going to be 100 years old.
Yeah.
If I keep doing this for 50 years, right? So it's kind of an inbuilt flaw where it means that it's hard to pull them together as a series at one time. You nearly
really, Steve? I mean, I think you're overthinking this. You're not that old. So you're worrying about a problem 45 years from now.
Right.
Yeah. Look, it's like my pension, I'm just thinking about the future. I'm worried about the future. Yeah.
Tell our listeners about the Clifton Cathedral. They can certainly go online and see some of your work and others, but what is different about the approach to the cathedral and entering the cathedral?
Yeah, I went over there last October. And again, it's a quick flight. Bristol is probably 2 hours by train west of London. So it kind of sits between Dublin and London in a way. So one of these kind of unusual flights that you get in the morning, and you kind of almost have to pinch yourself that it's still morning, but you're in a completely different city. And people speak similarly, but quite different. And there's other little cultural clues, the post boxes are red in the UK, whereas in Ireland they're green. There's little kind of things like that almost wake you up as the morning passes. So I land in Bristol Airport, which is this coastal airport. I think it's on a bit of a plain or like a bit of a high-rise terrain. And I get out of the plane and it's just completely foggy. Like there's this fog on the runway. And I've come over specifically to photograph this building on this day, thinking that my weather app would be reliant. And I guess a lot of architectural photographers and a lot of photographers would relate to this, that we're kind of glued to the weather apps and they can make or break our living, So I was over in Bristol and I landed and I'm met by a bunch of fog on the runway. So I head to the city and the fog is slowly starting to lift. And then through the fog emerges this concrete beacon of a cathedral, which of course I searched a bit about beforehand, but I try not to do too much research in advance, because then I guess you're going in with kind of maybe some preconceived angles, or it's almost like you're kind of already endorsing the project. And I already know I'm drawn towards that style, but I'm interested in maybe what has changed. So designed in 1973 by Ronald Weeks and Frederick Jennett and Anthony Pomezma at the Percy Thomas Partnership. The main thing, I guess, about this building is that it did undergo a renovation by a firm called Purcell in 2018. So what you're experiencing is this conserved piece of heritage. I think they did a really good job, and it's important to say that I wasn't commissioned by them to photograph this. This is a personal project. This is kind of a passion project. So I can go and I can hopefully be critical of some parts, but actually I was standing in that cathedral, was really peaceful, really quiet, and I'm not that religious, so that wouldn't be something that affects me, but there definitely was a spiritual nature to this space. The main thing that they did was they stopped the leak in the roof. I think there was pretty much a leak in the roof since it was built.
That's what a lot of these wind up being about. The rain.
These concrete buildings always have a hole somewhere.
Right. Especially where it rains, it's a problem.
Yeah, it rains. It sure does. So this roof is incredibly kind of experimental. It's got quite a steep pitch, and I think they replaced something like 86 tons of lead in the renovation. So quite impressive in terms of the engineering side of things.
Steve, one thing I'm struck with in looking at photos of the cathedral is that there are no pews. It's just stacked chairs that are placed very neatly around this giant floor area. That's quite unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, it's almost quite egalitarian or something. There's something very equal about it. And it is a Catholic church. So maybe, yeah, you're right. You would expect there maybe to be some sort of hierarchy. You know, now you should bow before.
Right. Where do you kneel?
I'm not sure. I didn't see it in use. I know it was when I was doing the exteriors, it was there was a funeral happening inside, and I'm just not that kind of photographer who wants to.
Yeah. I have the answer. There are kneeling pads that are hanging from the back of each of the stack chairs.
Okay.
So you lift up your kneeling pad, put it on the floor, and do your kneeling.
Yeah. I've never been to a mass where you didn't have to kneel, whether it be a funeral or a wedding or whatever.
Yeah. So it's an interesting workaround, I guess, because they were able to keep this modernist chair design. And even in the renovation, they stuck with that. I think they had them reupholstered. So it's nice that they've kept true to that approach and that style.
Well, it means that this entire floor space could be used for something else besides a service. I mean, in a typical cathedral, the pews are fixed. They're not going anywhere. But if you move all the chairs out, you could have
a rave.
Yeah, right. You could have a concert. You could have a performance, a play. I'm sure they've done a variety of kinds of events there over the last 50 years. Fascinating.
You could have a 10-year anniversary party for a podcast. I don't know.
What do you know? Great plan.
We were talking about that before we started.
I have been to Bristol, and it's a lovely town and a lovely small airport that you hop into. But I didn't get a chance to actually see this cathedral.
Because of the fog.
Yeah.
Most likely.
Because of the fog, yeah. It's constantly hidden in fog, yeah. No, I think it's up in this area called Clifton, which is just outside the main civic core. But it was my first time in Bristol as well, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing these trips, is to kind of explore new places and use the camera as a tool and a way of understanding. And I guess what maybe ties in with what you guys are doing is that it's a way of representing these things back to a wider community. And hopefully what I see, someone else might see. And there's an idea that I don't mean to enamor our job with too much meaning, but as photographers, we're trying to constantly show and tell stories or retell stories that are already out there.
So where do you want to go next?
Yeah, I guess that's the tricky thing, is that every year I'll look at buildings that were finished or opened in 1970, what are we now, 4?
Yeah.
And I'll see where I might be able to go. And there's a few other things I'll try link in with that. Like I brought a documentary photography self-published book out last year, and I'd love to bring that to a few art book fairs or zine fairs that kind of pop up in different cities. So there could be something where, I don't know, I discovered there's a building in Warsaw that was finished in 1974 that I like the look of. Hey, I've never been to Warsaw. If there's a zine or a book fair on, maybe I can pick up some commercial work while I'm there, and I get to photograph something modernist while I'm there as well. So that'd be a nice plan.
In the United States, we have something called the National Register of Historic Places, which always, with a very few exceptions, uses 50 years as the mark at which you qualify to apply for National Register status. Is there a similar system in the UK for a building getting that designation?
Yeah, both the Clifton Cathedral and the one I photographed in 2022, the Brunswick Centre, were Grade 2 listed. I think that's given out by the National Trust in the UK. I'm not sure who gives that out in Ireland, in the Republic. But we have a similar system here. It's a bit tough. It's tricky, right? These buildings kind of fall between not being old enough to maybe be enamored or romanticized like we might do to, I don't know, Versailles or the White House or, something from a previous era. But they're also not maybe new enough to be used the same way we use buildings nowadays, especially workplaces, which are highly serviced, right? We need so many wires and air conditioning and heating and all these kind of high intense places.
And the problem with modernist buildings in general is that they still look like the future. So it's hard for committees to think of them as historical.
Right.
Yeah, and even the word brutalism is kind of has a negative connotation, right? And
right.
I think that's part of what I'm trying to do is hopefully be part of the conversation that shows these places in a nice light and gives them a sense of meaning. And even if that meaning is of its time, that's something we can learn from as well. And we go, well, what were they responding to? A lot of brutalist buildings in the UK, for example, were responding to post-war rebuilding. And I can definitely speak for Ireland and say that a lot of the buildings of the 20th century were about finding our identity. Ireland's really only gained its independence in 1922. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of state building. We have some incredible Art Deco libraries in Dublin from the 30s. Small buildings, but they were state-built buildings that were just trying to almost just up the living standards and the quality of life. So things like post offices and libraries from that time are really special.
So how do you go about finding your next conquest? Do you just type buildings built in 1974 into Google? Is it that simple?
That's one way. Yeah. I don't try not to overly complicate it. But there's a lot of good resources out there. And every time I come back to it every year to do a bit of a deep dive, I find more and more. A lot of them have been mapped, which is really handy. A lot of them have been organized by year. So there's a lot of good archives out there that you can tap into. And I think it's something that stems from architecture school. We would go, no matter what city we went to visit, there'd be an itinerary where we would try visit a kind of a whistle-stop tour of the greatest hits of that city or that town.
Steve's website, which is the shortest I've ever seen, is ste.ie. That's it. 5 letters. It's a 5-letter website. You just don't run into that every single day.
Is it succinct?
It's the best I could do. I can't go much shorter than that.
Yeah.
Are any of the Clifton Cathedral photographs on the site?
Not yet. Most of the stuff on the site is commissioned work because I guess there's a kind of a transactional idea there. But yeah, I'm trying to be braver and put some non-commissioned work up there. And,
please do.
Yeah, I think there's something about showing, because it's stuff you're drawn to. And as I said, there's no architect over your shoulder telling you to take this photo or that photo. You're kind of free to explore the building. And as I said, I do spend a day with these places. So I kind of get to see the light move around. And, I'll have lunch nearby and observe the shadows and the movement of people in and out of this place. So there is something about a dedication to time and place and light.
And weather.
Fog, definitely. That I hope people can relate to or that they can appreciate. So, yeah, thanks for the encouragement. I'll try to get that up on the website.
Absolutely, yeah. By the time our listeners hear this, maybe they can see it on your website.
I'll try not to make any promises because it's always the last thing that gets done. I'm too busy doing everything for everyone else.
Right,
but,
right. Yeah. The shoemaker's children have no shoes.
That's exactly it, yeah.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for all the work that you do.
Unless it's Frank Gehry, trying to get people to talk about terrible buildings is tough, and there are lots of terrible buildings. We can't blame architects, really, can we, as they are often driven by clients with limited budgets. Fortunately, There's a podcast for that. Artist and journalist Sara Tietje-Mietz and Erin Kennealy are the host of the new podcast, Bad Architecture, a deliciously daft dialogue on cringeworthy design. Each episode discusses 2 bad projects, I think that's capital B, capital P, capped off by a badass piece of architecture, projects such as Linda Hazard's Starvation Heights, Nevada's Clown Motel, and that 90s over-the-top mall destination, the Rainforest Cafe. Sara has degrees from Lesley University,
Go Lynx!
Syracuse,
Go Orange!
and the Art Institute of Chicago.
Go Art!
Sure. Mixed media artist and children's book author Erin Kennealy also attended the Art Institute of Chicago.
We've got art. Yes, we do. We've got art. How about you?
Oh, shake those pom-poms, boy. And she has a guinea fowl named Charlie. Welcome, Sara and Erin.
Thank you.
Hello.
We're happy to be
Thank
here.
you.
Hi.
So, Sara, before we get into architecture, I have to ask, you've been involved in the Association for Gravestone Studies. I bet you have some awesome Halloween parties. Tell me about this group.
So the Association for Gravestone Studies, I haven't been involved with them for a bit, but they are an amazing organization that's, if you're a taphophile, this is your group to join.
Taphophile? What's that?
It means you just, you love cemeteries and tombstones. You can't get enough of them.
Okay, so that's legal. All right.
Okay.
Yes, that's illegal. Nothing too wrong there except for having too much passion for it.
Okay.
So it's really fun. Yeah.
And do you have Halloween parties?
Haven't had one for a bit, but it is one of my favorite holidays. And I believe that Halloween decor is year-round decor. It's not just one day. It's all year round for me.
Got it.
Does this group, does it do preservation, like fixing up gravestones or documenting them, or what does it get into?
It does a bit of everything. Some of the conferences and meetings that I've been to, there's different chapters throughout the country, more regional or statewide chapters. I was part of the New York State one. And they'll have lectures and meetings where people will talk about gravestones, talk about research for it, and give preservation examples. Been to one where I got to learn how to clean and fix on a small scale, not doing anything really massive, but basic cleaning and care for gravestones to people researching really interesting materials or stone carvers or just histories. So it's a little bit of everything and definitely worth checking out if you love cemeteries and old gravestones.
Well, they are kind of like a database.
Yeah.
Of a specific kind.
They are, and their newsletter is fantastic.
So I got to ask, what do you clean it with? Is it a Windex thing? Is it 409? What's the best way to clean a gravestone?
I want to say it's this bio cleaner, and I'm forgetting the name of it. It's like D24, D52, something like that. It helps inhibit growth, but it's a really gentle cleanser to take off any of the lichen or bio growth off of it. Very gentle. You never want to use like bleach or a steel brush or anything, but it continues to clean as it stays on. It's pretty cool. And,
so I guess taking out my belt sander to my grandpa's stone is not the best idea.
No.
I don't think so. I don't think so. But, people do crazy things. They use shaving cream, sandblasting. They'll get out little chisels to re-chisel and get stuff in there. So they're a great resource. Yeah, bad practices, but they're a great resource.
Now, Erin, there's a lot of real whimsy in your art, which I've seen online.
Oh.
But your inspiration is your grandmother. What was she like?
Well, my great-grandmother, she was a tough woman, funny, artsy. She's kind of what I would think of as a black sheep in her time. She grew up in a very small village in Austria-Hungary at the time, and she made friends with the Roma against her family's wishes. She painted on the side of her house, big flower garden. This was not done. This is a, small Lutheran community in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He just didn't do it. So I always took her kind of quiet sass. I love it. And so I use that to inspire me.
Well, there's a lot of quiet sass in your podcast, which I love, which is great.
Thank you.
How did you all come about creating that?
Well, one day, Sara texted me and said, "Hey, do you want to do a podcast?" And I said, "Okay." And that's how it started.
That's kind of how we started.
Did you have a topic then or what?
It was bad architecture. These were I always love researching into the stories, the weird places, the weird people. And Erin and I loved that when we were in school together, any of our site visits that we do or the travels that we do for school, we love the weird and the wacky and have always just connected on that. And this was kind of during I think it was the first year of the pandemic, and I was feeling itchy to do something. I wanted to do some of my own research, and what sparked interest in me was this, like bad architecture. Let's talk about the bad things, and bad can mean so many things. And the first person that came to my head to do it with me was Erin. So I was like, I've never done a podcast. I had only started listening to podcasts like a couple years prior. I was very late to the game. And I just thought it would be fun. I was like, hey, that's a way for us to connect as friends. We live very far apart now. And it just sounded like a fun time for us to be able to do the research and talking about buildings in the way that we wanted to do it.
So where do you guys live?
Well, I live in Homer Glen, Illinois, which is like southwest of Chicago.
Okay.
And I live in Syracuse, New York, bullseye middle of New York State.
So do you ever go to visit any of these bad places together?
We haven't, but we want to now quite badly. There's a few places now on our list. Apparently, Las Vegas and the surrounding area has quite a few places for us to go visit together. So
sure,
it's up there.
For heaven's sake, yeah.
Yes. We have a bucket list now, so we have to do it someday, but we haven't yet.
Well, I want to talk about some specific examples of bad architecture in a minute, but let's fast forward to this phenomenon that a really bad building, after X number of years, becomes beloved. Mm-hmm. Have you ever noticed that?
Yes.
It can happen. You think of the style at the time. One building that comes to mind and which still has really polarizing effect on people is Boston City Hall. Mm-hmm. I love it. People still feel very distinct feelings about it, some positive, some very negative. And it did over time really gain a lot more popularity and understanding and acceptance. And sometimes it's like a good, bad movie, those really bad movies that gain a cult following. I think that can happen too.
Agreed.
Boston City Hall, for those of you that aren't Googling it right now, is a giant brutalist structure, concrete with all kinds of crazy angles, almost impossible to air condition and heat, almost impossible to renovate because it's full of concrete.
And it now has a slide out front, I think, right?
A slide, really?
Like for kids?
I think they put a slide in, like a big slide.
Oh, okay.
Okay, why? Do you know?
Entertainment value, I guess, Tom.
I mean, why not?
Yeah.
Pop a slide on it, It's for kids.
Oh, my God. And one that I think of is the Thompson Center in Chicago, right? Because Sarah went to school here in Chicago and we saw it. And for years, it was this, oh, God, that building, right? in Chicago. But now everybody's freaking out because, Google bought it. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? So it's one of those things where it's almost like I can make fun of my little brother, but you can't.
Yeah.
Like you can't hurt them. So it's an interesting phenomenon to see what happens with architecture that way.
And sometimes it's, the design or the materials or the siting of it, and people just don't understand, or that's very, there's a lot of tradition that comes with architecture. And when that is challenged, I think people tend to balk first. It can be a bit, put up their hands and be like, ooh, a little bit first. And I think time gives space for people to investigate and to understand and look into it and really start to see something in a bit deeper of a way. And then sometimes things just don't, because they're just bad, Bad design does just exist, and some things are just never good.
Well, on one of your recent bad architecture podcasts, you talked about spite houses. What's a spite house?
Ooh, spite house is something that was built specifically to piss somebody else off. It's the middle finger of architecture to somebody else. That it's like your neighbor that you just hate. You don't want to put up a fence, put up a bad house, put up a spite house, really flip them the bird, but with architecture. That's how I think of it.
That's a really expensive way to make a point.
Yeah.
But the point is made. The point gets made.
Yes. Yes. And also, if you want a lasting point that just digs in the person that you're feeling spiteful towards, this is the way to do it.
Yeah, there was a famous Curb Your Enthusiasm episode where Larry David did a spite coffee shop next to the coffee shop he hated.
Oh, I remember that.
Remember that one?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay.
So this is the same lines here. We got spite houses. And you all talked on the show about one in Alameda. Tell me about that.
So the Alameda Spite House, when you're doing historic research, sometimes it's hard to find something. Finding definitives can be hard. We don't know that this house was specifically built to spite the person next door, but when you look at it, when you see the plot that it's built on, it is so narrow. It's like 9 feet wide. And you could, from your neighbor's house, reach out and probably close the shutter on the outside of the house. It's that close. And then the street's just on the other side. So they're blocking the view of the street. They're blocking the sunlight. We couldn't find anything definitive, but people believed that it was built either out of spite for the city because they changed the street, out of spite for the neighbor.
Does anybody live there?
People live there. Yeah, people have lived there. They say it, it's tiny house living. It's popular.
You ever been to the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California?
No, not in person, but
Okay.
wow.
No.
Yeah.
It's a whole different thing. It's
Wanna
not a
go.
spite house, but yeah, it has
Whole
lots
different
of...
thing, but that's just expansive to the point where there's just
Right.
pop a staircase over there,
Stairways that
Right.
go nowhere.
Yeah.
Hallways that end up crazy places.
rooms that you can enter but not leave.
Door to nowhere.
Yeah.
Right. Oh my
This
God.
house in Alameda, though, it's become known as the Spite House.
Yeah, it's called Alameda Spite House. They did there's a stained glass piece in the transom, and that I think happened in the 70s, but it's gained that. And during the time, early after it was built, the woman next door tragically died by suicide. And there was speculation around if the house next door, the Spite House, had anything to do with it. So the mythology around it started really early, and people latch on to kernels like that. But people go and people search it out. It's been on lots of lists, lots of architectural blogs, lots of travel blogs for the Spite House. I mean, from the outside, think of 9 feet wide.
Yeah.
It's not...
Yeah,
it's barely a bay. So
right up your bad alley there for the podcast. Boy.
Exactly.
Perfect.
It was perfect.
So what makes for bad architecture? Give us some examples. You've done now, about a dozen shows?
We just recorded our 10th official episode, which will be coming out soon. That's what I love about bad. It's so, for a short word, it's so broad. Yeah.
Subjective and broad. I find with us, it's not often the actual architecture that's bad, although we have covered that. But some of these stories, oh my goodness, are what make it bad. As you referenced, Dr. Hazard. Wow. As far as I'm concerned, sometimes I'll find gems of architecture, but they have just the weirdest stories and the weirdest people associated with it that I have to talk about it.
Well, don't leave us hanging. Tell us about Dr. Hazard.
Yeah, who's this Dr. Hazard anyway?
Dr. Hazard. Okay, so Dr. Hazard was a woman, and we could call her a quack or a con artist, but I think that she's one of those people that truly believed in what she was selling. And she created a spa or a healing place at the turn of the last century. And people would come there for her treatment, which was basically starvation, fierce walking, slapping massages, and enemas.
Oh, what was the first one? Fierce walking?
Fierce walking. That was her
like
terminology.
forced marching. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, like you had to
Power
walk
walking,
fast. Yeah,
vigorous.
like not strolling through the surrounding wooded area. It was fierce. You had to walk fast and rid yourself of whatever diseases that she thought you had. And people flock for this treatment.
So did this work?
Well, there are some people that say they were changed for the better for the treatment, but there were people that died.
At least 15 people, according to Wikipedia. Yep.
Yes,
Wow.
Yes, a number of people who died. So it's probably not a good treatment. But there is I imagine there's like a euphoria from these treatments that comes, like a runner's high almost. And I think that's why people thought that she was doing them some good.
Yeah,
And
like
she was-
delirium.
like a delirious euphoria.
So did she have
Oh,
a
my
crazy
goodness.
house?
No, she had just a plain, I would call it California style bungalow. in little cabins. And then after a while, after she killed a bunch of people, left and came back to the U.S., she built a 3-story, just a clapboard, like spa house. So it was unremarkable architecture, but the person behind it was so crazy that, it fit right in.
Let's talk about a landmark from the 90s that many people recognize that I think is a great example of bad architecture, the Rainforest Cafe. And I understand, Sara, that you were a frequent guest in the Rainforest Cafe in your youth.
I wouldn't say frequent, but I definitely had visited one or two. And, it makes me think of mall culture and all those just themed restaurant experiences of the 90s. It's so visceral thinking of those places because it's like the colors, the fabrics, the food, and wow, thinking of the Rainforest Cafe, that's what sparked the idea for the Bad Eats episode. Sometimes a building sparks it and sometimes we just have the theme to go off of. But yeah, the Rainforest Cafe, I mean, the story behind it is just as good as the bad architecture and crazy design of the actual rainforest cafes. So that one was really fun to do. I mean, if anybody has been to one, you remember these oversized, outsized animals and foliage, some of it that moved, it rained, so you were
Oh, that's
damp.
right. Yeah.
You'd be eating and you'd be damp.
Yeah.
Great. That's soggy. I just remember feeling damp the whole time. And, the animatronic animals and animal noises. And, some of the designs that they did were really intricate. And there was a lot of money to design these like starscapes on the ceiling and, orchestrate these thunderstorms with rain and animal calls. And there was this tree that talked. It was wild.
And how much were the burgers? Like $35 for this privilege?
And this is in the 90s for like $19 burgers or $15 burgers or something like that. And so the food, I think when it started, it was more focused, as chains often do. It kind of, as it expanded, it kind of got bigger but worse. Sorry, you can hear my dog probably drinking water in the background.
Oh, yeah,
that's what it was.
That's all right. Makes me thirsty.
So the food wasn't anything spectacular.
I don't remember any of the food. Actually.
Exactly.
And I went there once and I don't remember any food. I just remember feeling a little overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And it was like an accost on all of your senses because it was all the audio, all the visual, all the food, all the smells, and like that slight tinge of chlorine because again, you're getting misted, you're damp. And then you go to the gift shop and buy like a furry animal that they say is going to, I don't know, support the rainforest, but how much of that actually goes to it? And then what do you do with these like massive structures and spaces that are very specifically designed once the restaurant fails? And that wasn't the craziest part. The craziest part is that this guy that built it built like a speck of it in his own home with actual live animals.
What?
He spent like $400,000 doing it.
Yeah, to like bring in millionaires, and he'd bring in people to try to get them to buy into this like experience. His own house had waterfalls and like tortoises. Where did he get tortoises? What happened to the tortoises? Where are they now? Somebody, it haunts me.
PetSmart.
It haunts me.
Yeah.
Well, in case Rainforest Cafe is listening, you have redeemed yourself. There are like 13, 14 locations. Still going strong all around the country, now lasting 30 years. So this is one of those things where, this concept, which is maybe unappealing to some at the beginning, has lasted, and people seem to love it now.
Entertainment. I mean, at the peak, they had over 100 at least nationwide and then some international. So it's kind of paired off a bit. I remember the one in Chicago. It was anchoring a corner across from, a giant McDonald's and had a giant frog on the building just hanging on it. And I think it just is still there like that. Yeah.
Well, it is. And I just recently sent Sara an article about how edible and pot distributor was trying to get in there. You make it their big store in Chicago.
Oh, yeah, that would be
very, very Alice in Wonderland.
Seems appropriate.
Now, a lot of the locations we've been talking about are, to be fair, interiors. So what are some of the buildings where the actual architecture is just super bad in your view?
I'm going to go first, Sarah. And this, I'm torn. I love it and I hate it at the same time. I'm going to talk about Xanadu. Right, Sarah? Yeah. Xanadu. I never saw the ones in Florida or Tennessee, but I saw the one in Wisconsin Dells, and it was the foam house of tomorrow. And as an adult, I love it and hate it.
What is it? I've never heard of it.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So this real nice man decided he was going to start building houses made out of foam. He was inspired by seeing futuristic architects in the late 60s, early 70s. And so he decided he was going to make this giant balloon bladder and build his own house in the middle of a blizzard. And he did so in just a few days. And so then he teamed up with other architects, and he wanted to bring his idea to like the public. And he would have an architect kind of design the space, and they were all different. But he used this white insulating foam, and it hardens like a cement around these dome shapes. And he made 3 of these things where you could go, you could pay your money, you could go look through it. And they were supposed to be computerized houses of tomorrow. So basically an early smart home before they had the technology to make it so. He had all these big dreams, and they never really came to fruition, which is kind of sad. He made his destination, like, museum type houses that you would go look at, but he never really took off like he thought it would. But I love this house because as a kid, it was just this wild dome, white, like organic shapes. And it was just the coolest place to go. And I think it's one of the things that started me liking architecture as more than just an abstract. But now that I'm older, I'm like, the windows, they just sealed them in. So if one broke, you had to chip it out and put a new one in. So there's like design flaws inherent in it. But I still think it's cool. Like I said, it's a love-hate thing, especially since they put shag carpet in the whole thing, even outside.
It's a Xanadu?
Yeah, Xanadu.
There is a great book, and if you are as great at finding books as Erin is, fantastic book on it that you can find that I highly, she sent it as a gift to me, and it is a trip and worth it. Find the book. I think it's...
Oh, she's got it.
Oh, she's holding up the book.
So as you can see,
The Computerized Home of Tomorrow.
Okay.
Wild, fantastic dome house.
The podcast is Bad Architecture with Erin and Sara. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us,
Thank
George.
you.
This has been a blast. And we're thinking about having guests next season on our podcast. And we'd love you to join us for one of our episodes if you're available.
Awesome. Glad to.
We'd love to hear your take on bad architecture.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, he can do that.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Malibu, Palm Springs, Toronto, and Los Angeles. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,500 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by archivist Kelly Policelli. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another mouth-watering edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.